Good morning, Highland. Or if you're watching this later on Sunday, good afternoon, good evening. Glad that we can join together in this Bible study and continue our study in the book of Genesis. Obviously, if you've been paying attention to our classes or been tuning in, I am not Chris Nicola. I am Brandon Greene, the Associate Minister at the Highland Church of Christ. So Chris is taking a short break. He's been doing a great job, but we gave him a break from class, and so I'm going to be teaching this class today. If you've been paying attention, we are using the Foundations Quarterly from the Gospel Advocate, and so if you have the book, hopefully you've read Lesson 9 in preparation for this study. So we are talking or being introduced in Genesis chapter 12. That's where we're continuing our lesson from. We are being introduced to a man named Abram. Now, you may not be as familiar with the name Abram, but if you are familiar with the Bible at all, you can probably already guess whose name this is. And we know that his name does not stay Abram for long. His name eventually is changed by God to Abraham. And we know Abraham to be one of the fathers of faith. He is in the Hall of Faith, as we normally subtitle Hebrews chapter 11, the great Hall of Faith, and what that looks like, and the examples that are set before us, and that Abraham is listed as one of these faithful children of God in Hebrews 11, and you can specifically read verses 8 through 19, but you see how important Abraham's life is, or example is, to even us today. He's the father of faith. He is the beginning of the children of Israel, which would eventually bring the seed of Jesus. So Abraham is a very important figure in Scripture. And so, of course, before he's Abraham, he is Abram. But just so we're not confused, I understand that his name in here is Abram, but if I say Abraham, you know who I'm talking about. If I say Sarah, you know that I'm talking about Sarai, which is her name before Sarah, before God changed it. But these are important characters, and by the way, if you're not familiar with the Bible, Sarah is Abraham's wife. But these are important characters in the biblical story. And bring to light how we even today came to be children of God. So, as we're looking at Abram's life, as we're starting his journey, starting in Genesis chapter 12, we'll read that in just a moment. But what is faith? What is faith? I think that that's an important question to this discussion, because we are introducing, again, the father of faith. We're introducing a figure of faith here that we should definitely, so many things about him we should be implementing in our own life of faith towards God. So many things that we can learn from Abram, what to do and what not to do. In chapter 12 already is a chapter that we need to be aware of. So, or look to Abram and his examples that we see of being faithful. So it's very important that we define what faith is. And I think Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 definitely defines for us what faith is. So look at this verse with me. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So if you're familiar at all with the Bible, if you're familiar at all with the book of Hebrews, it's a very popular, well-known verse, especially within the church. And there it is for a reason, because this gives us a good definition of what faith is. And I think oftentimes because of the world, because of how the world may define faith, they defined it as if it's this blind leap, right? This blind leap of hope, that you hope that it may happen, right? That there's a chance that it won't. That is the world's definition of faith often. Well, I'll have faith in you. Well, that doesn't always necessarily mean that they truly believe that that person's going to follow through. There's still that chance that they won't actually do whatever it is or accomplish whatever the goal is. So sometimes the way in which the world uses faith, again, suggests that it's a blind leap. That it's a blind leap in the dark and we're not sure if it will actually happen. Well, that's not how the Bible defines faith. That is not how the Hebrew writer defines faith. The Hebrew writer defines it as what? An assurance. An assurance of things hoped for. So what are we hoping for? We are hoping for the promises of God. Now that's going to be so important to this discussion about this man Abram and why his faith was so huge, especially when you read the beginning of chapter 12 of the book of Genesis. The faith that we are defining is an assurance in the promises of God. And it's also a conviction to the things that we cannot physically see. None of us have physically seen God, but we are assured that he exists. We see evidence. We are convicted of the evidence that we see, that God does exist. And therefore, if God exists as he is, then we can fully have assurance in the promises that he keeps or delivers. So that is our definition of faith. And I want that to be crystal clear for those who are not familiar with the biblical story or our belief system when it comes to the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's an assurance. It's not a blind leap. So if we're going to dedicate our lives to God, we better have assurance in the message of God. We better have assurance in God's promises, God himself. So I want to make that crystal clear in this discussion because that's so important. And so as you continue to read in Hebrews 11, you see the man Abraham. And in verse number 8, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and when he went out, not knowing where he was going. So here's one characteristic of his faith here that is demonstrated. And see, that's really the point that the Hebrew writer is getting at. Abraham demonstrated his faith. It's not enough to just believe in something. That belief should always cause action. So because he had faith in God's promise, Abraham acted. Abraham obeyed. So I hope that you're starting to get the glimpse of what biblical faith is. Biblical faith is an assurance it's a conviction in God and his promises, and it causes us to be obedient. It causes action on the part of the one who is faithful. So with that being said, there are so many things that the Hebrew writer brings out about Abraham and his faith. And so we're going to be giving an introduction to this man, if you would. And so there are going to be some pieces that we're going to talk about that we're going to get more in depth in later lessons. So I'm not going to get too in depth into the situations, but there's so many examples. Obviously, I mean, for the hall of faith here in chapter 11, for Abraham to have most of the discussion from verses 8 through 19 says a lot about him. So he makes up most of the discussion in Hebrews 11, most of the examples in Hebrews 11. So there's a lot to be said about Abraham's faith. Verse 11 tells us, by faith Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful he had promised. So even Sarah, his wife, is an example of faith. Verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So again, Abraham is a great example of what faith is. And so if you read through Hebrews 11 verses 8 through 19, you get glimpses and details into the definition of faith, and then also the examples. And Abraham is definitely one of those great examples. So let's get into the text here in in Genesis chapter 12. And we're going to start at verse number 1, and we're going to read to the end of the chapter, and then we're going to get into these discussion points. And what I want you to think about here, in thinking about and beginning to think about this man, Abram, who later again becomes Abraham, I want you to start to think about the challenges that Abraham is going to face as a man of faith. Because faith does not come without its challenges. There are so many challenges that we are going to face that are going to try to derail us from being faithful to God. And so I want you to think about that as you're reading through and looking at the life of Abraham here. So let's start reading in chapter 12. Now, verse 1, now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran. And they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land of the place of Shechem to the oak of Moreh. At the time the Canaanites were in the land, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abraham journeyed on, still going toward the Negeb. Verse number 10. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance, and when the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful, and when the prince of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and for her sake he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So, again, I want you to be thinking about the challenges that Abraham faced, or that Abram faced early on. And so we want to talk about a few of these challenges as we're looking at, but there are, again, challenges ahead, and Abram is not immune to the challenges that we face as we try to live a life of faith. Now, here's the interesting thing. Now, we don't know God's interaction with Abram before chapter 12. We're not sure what God's interaction was with Abram up until this point. So it begs the question, why would Abram follow God? Well, either he knew of God beforehand, which I think is probably true. He knew of God, and so when God presented himself to Abram as God, as Lord, Abram said, "Okay, whatever you tell me to do, I will follow." So Abram at the beginning definitely had the right attitude, the right demeanor, but yet even this man who started off with a great example of faith still had his challenges. I mean, we even read to the end of chapter 12 that he had some challenges. So let's discuss some of these as we're giving this introduction to the man, this father of faith, Abram. What challenges did he face? Well, one of the challenges that I believe he faced was definitely patience. Patience. Now, think about this. We're probably like this when it comes to God. Please give me patience, and could you do it now, right? Dear God, please give me patience, and please do it now. Right? That's our attitude. It's difficult for us to be patient. And I want you to think about the promises that God was giving to Abram here. So the promises are listed here in verses 1 through 3. So let's read these passages one more time. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And you and all your families of the earth shall be blessed." So why would Abram have some difficulty when it comes to God's promises? Well, think about this. So God promised in verse number 2, God promised Abraham that he would make him a great nation. So remember, they have no children at this point. They have no children. Isaac, who we're going to be eventually introduced to, comes later, much later. So I want you to think about this. Here's a promise of God. And I'm sure Abram is excited, right? I mean, this is a big promise that he's going to make a nation out of you. And you have no children. But yet, as the passage tells us, he's 75 years old. And he was forced to wait 25 more years before this promise would even start to be fulfilled. Because the bottom line is, would Abraham ever see his great nation? No, he's not going to see his great nation. He wouldn't live long enough to see how great his nation became, how massive his people would be. But just to see the beginning of the promise being fulfilled, he would have to wait 25 years. So think about the patience that Abraham would have to have. I mean, think about this. If God were to come, matter of fact, if I were to tell you that if you were to take this job, and in 25 years, you'll be a millionaire, how many people would sign up? But in between that 25 years, you're going to go through a lot of challenges. You're going to go through a lot of problems. But in 25 years, you'll be a millionaire. How many people will sign the dotted line? Probably not many, because we're not that patient, right? We're not that patient. And yet, Abraham had to wait 25 years. So we all know what eventually happened. Did he ever doubt God? Did he ever consider to go back home? Well, we do know that him and Sarai took matters into their own hands, didn't they? Sarah basically suggested for Abraham to take one of their handmaidens, Hagar, and sleep with her, she would become his wife, and that they would have a seed through her, basically telling God, you need help fulfilling your promise because we've been waiting long enough. And so Ishmael is born. He's not the promised one. God tells him he's not the promised one. But 25 years later, eventually they do have Isaac. So even such a great man as Abram had his challenges and wanted to take matters into his own hands. I think about this passage, Isaiah 49 and verse 23. For they shall not be ashamed who wait for me. Of course, Isaiah is talking about God. Those of us, we would not be ashamed if we would just wait on God. Why is this? So there are so many challenges, and I believe one of those things is being patient. The second thing that I want us to think about is another challenge. And remember when I said maybe one of the questions that Abram had was, should I just go back home, right? Back to the comfort of home, what I know. And oftentimes that's exactly what happens. When we're derailed from our faith, we are tempted to go back to our previous life, back to our previous journey that led to nothing, that led to destruction. And part of this is dealing with disappointment. Now, why would we be bringing this up? Well, look at the other promise, the second promise, actually the first promise that is given here in Genesis 12 and verse 1. God promises Abram land. God promises Abram land. Now, just so you understand, and when one thing that is brought up in our lesson plan, our quarterly, it's interesting that God commands Abram to go to this promised land, but there are stipulations to what he's supposed to do. Remember, he's supposed to leave his kindred, he's supposed to leave his father's land, father's house, and he's supposed to go to this land. But if you notice in verse 4, we know that Lot follows him and he brings Sarai. So it's interesting that God still allows Abram to go to the promised land, even though God told him to leave his relatives. But he doesn't leave all of them, right? And he also even brings a group from Haran that he acquired, servants probably, that are part of the family household, because that's how servants were looked at. They were looked at as part of the household in the patriarchal system that they were currently living in. So he was supposed to leave everything and go, but he didn't. But yet God still allowed him to take his journey. So it was almost as if he was partially being obedient, right? But God promised him land, okay? And think about this. It's approximate, according to historians and people who have studied the possible locations of where these lands are. and we have a general sense of where the lands are today, but sometimes sometimes we're not 100% sure on everything. All right, so approximately this travel was about 400 miles from where they were to getting to the promised land. So it's a lot of miles to travel on camel, on foot, right? So they had to make this journey together, 400 miles. Take a long time to get there. But they go. But when they get there, you've arrived at your destination. So I just want you to think about this. In Genesis 12 and verse 10, we know that there was a famine in the land. Not only that, the land was also inhabited. So there were other people that were living in the land. So think about this. If I promised you a house, and this house had needed maintenance, and not only that, there were people already living there they had to kick out. I mean, that's sort of the picture that I get here of this promised land. So what do you think may have happened? I mean, maybe Abram's idea was a land like this, right? And this would be our idea. Like if somebody's going to promise us an amazing place and we're going to become something great. I mean, this is probably what we were thinking of, right? But that's not where Abram went. He went to a land that was already inhabited, that was in the middle of a drought. So, I mean, could you see the disappointment? I think we probably would be. But I want you to notice what Abram does. In verse number 7, once the Lord appears to him and tells him, to your offspring I will give this land, what does Abram do? He builds an altar to the Lord. He builds an altar to the Lord and he starts to worship God. My question to you is, would this be our attitude? But why may it not be our attitude all the times? Because I think sometimes we get disappointed because our expectations are way too high. Now, what I mean by that is we basically put things into God's promise that isn't there. So this prosperity preaching that a lot of televangelists preach to people, if you would just give a certain amount to God, then God will make you a millionaire. He'll bless you with that huge house. He'll bless you with all of this stuff. Well, that's not in God's promise. That wasn't in even God's promise here. He just said, I'm going to make you a great nation. Well, what was this nation supposed to be great about? They were supposed to be great in the sense that they were God's representation on earth. Now, yes, there were other things that God gave to them, like riches and things of that nature. And the fact that, they were in a land that was full of milk and honey. I mean, it was plentiful. It was great. And that was wonderful. But that wasn't ultimately God's plan and God's promise. His promise was to make them a great nation because, again, they're connected. That nation would be connected to him. So maybe the reason why we may be disappointed at times, we may put extreme expectations to God's promises that are simply not there. The question is, are you thankful for God's blessings in those promises as it is written? Not what we imagine, as it is written. Are we thankful for God's promises? Are we thankful for God's blessings? Are we okay with the blessings that Paul tells the Ephesian brethren about because they are spiritually connected to God? Are we okay with that? Abram was okay with what God blessed him with. Do you take what he has given you and see greatness in it? for whatever, we're not sure exactly why. Well, I mean, we are told why Abram travels to Egypt, but what God never told him to actually go to Egypt. I mean, he just sees a famine, he goes to a place to hopefully get relief, right? And Egypt was the world power during this time. But obviously, for a brief moment, we at least see that Abram was grateful and that he did see greatness in what God gave him. Do we see that same greatness in the promises that God has given us today? Are you content with what God has given you? Think about Hebrews 13 verse 5. Keep your life free from the love of money and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Now, this passage may be directly talking about money or possession, but I want you to think about it in regards to promises. Are we content with God's promises, the way in which he has delivered them? He will never leave you nor forsake you. That's a promise. Do we truly believe in that? So maybe we struggle in our faith. We may struggle with disappointment, and there may be a lot of reasons why we get disappointed. But we have to sit back and really think about, are we okay with the direct promises that God has given? And we need to be okay with them. Abram definitely was. The other challenge that I think we face in faith is submission. Submission, right? Simon Says, famous game, right? As long as Simon says it, you're supposed to do it. Well, obviously, it's not a game when it comes to God. When God says to do something, we ought to do it, right? And God said. So God told Abram, and he did exactly what God told him to do. Many people believe they know better than God. Can you believe that? That we sometimes believe that we know better than God? I know that's true because if we never sinned, if we never sinned, then we would always 100% believe that God knows better than we do. But the bottom line is we still disobey him at times. So there are times in which we believe that we know better than God. We may think that some of God's commands are weird or strange. Baptism, for a lot of people, it's almost like it's weird, it's taboo, it's strange, but that is the medium that God has chosen for us to show our obedience to him for salvation to then kick in. Yet Abraham obeyed God. I mean, think about it. He has no idea where this land is. He has no GPS. The only GPS that he has is God himself. And he's never been to this land. And God's telling him to go. So for many of us, if somebody were to come to you and say, I'm going to drop everything that you're doing and follow me to this place you've never been, all of us probably would be like, not doing that. Right? But that's exactly what God told Abraham. Follow me. Follow me to this place you've never been. Abraham had to have enough trust and enough faith in God to act. Abraham lived by the very words of the prophet Samuel. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord. Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. Obedience. God wants our obedience, and Abraham lived by that. Especially here in this passage. But that doesn't mean he never had his time of disobedience. He definitely did. But we at least see early on, he obeyed. He obeyed and he went. Hebrews 11:19, he considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. What is this passage referring to? It's referring to God wanting to sacrifice Isaac, or God telling Abraham to sacrifice his only begotten son, the promised seed, to sacrifice him. This was Abraham's belief that God was going to bring him back, that God was able. There were many moments in Abraham's life that he believed that God was able and that God knew better than him. Do we believe that? Do we trust God? Do we have enough faith in God? Disappointment can definitely be a challenge. The last thing I want us to talk about, and then I want to conclude with the later half of chapter 12. But in this discussion or introduction of Abraham, the last thing I want us to discuss is silence. We may have trouble because of silence. What do I mean by that? God doesn't say or tell us every single little detail about our lives. I want you to think about this. 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3 gives us a generality of life. His divine power, being God, has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Now, I think all of us who are in the kingdom would agree with this passage and would agree with Peter that we have everything that pertains to life and godliness. But sometimes we struggle because not everything has a "thus saith the Lord" attached to it. What do I mean? Here's a question that you may have to ask yourself or wrestle with at some point. Where should I send my child or grandchild to college? Should I send them? Where should I send them, right? I mean, there isn't a "thus saith the Lord" attached to that, right? God is not going to tell you, thus saith the Lord, you shall take your child to Notre Dame. I mean, there's no passage that says that, should you take this new job or move your family? I mean, this is definitely something that I would be on my hands and knees and praying about, but God isn't going to, there's no "thus saith the Lord, take the job," I mean, we're not told everything, right? But I do think and I do believe that when we pray to God, that God does answer that prayer and that he reveals that answer in some way, shape, or another. But we're not always sure of everything. We're not puppets, and God is, pulling our strings 24/7, right? So there are some decisions that you and I have to make, and we definitely need to be praying to God for direction, but that doesn't mean we're going to hear his voice necessarily in our ear. Should you retire now or try to work a few more years? I mean, these are questions that we have to wrestle with, that we don't have a "thus saith the Lord." When we are introduced to Abraham, we're introduced to him at 75. He dies at 175. So that means that we see about 100 years of Abraham's service to God. And in those 100 years, we only see God communicating with him only 8 times. Now, that's not saying that he didn't communicate more than 8 times, but that's all we have recorded. So even Abraham may have wrestled with figuring out, what does God want in every situation. We aren't sure of other times God communicated with him, but we can assume that he had to make some decisions as a leader. So I think about this. We can be assured of this, Colossians 3 and verse 17, "And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus," or by the authority, by his direction, giving thanks to God the Father through him. So everything that we are about, we must think about our relationship to Jesus first. We must think about our relationship to God first. That sort of that helps us to navigate through the areas in which God doesn't directly address to our specific problem, right? But we can use God through prayer and through his word to help us navigate through this life. So it's not necessarily that God is silent, but again, we don't always have a thus saith the Lord answer to everything. And if we're honest, there are a lot of things that we wrestle with that don't have a thus saith the Lord attached to it. But we can still lean upon God for direction. We can still lean upon God's word, and it does help us navigate through those moments that we don't necessarily have a thus saith the Lord answer. So I want you to think about this. We may struggle in our faith when it comes to patience. We may struggle in our faith when it comes to the disappointment. We may struggle with submission, and we struggle sometimes in silence. But Abraham is a great example of what it means to move past through these challenges. He faced them all, and yet we read about him in Hebrews 11 as a champion of faith. So the question is, will your faith in God conquer all? Well, obviously, Abraham's faith in God conquered all. So I want to address the last part of this chapter so that way we have it in here. But you know the story at the end, that when Abram and Sarai go to Egypt because of the famine, because Sarai was an attractive woman, Abram was afraid for his life, and so he told Sarai to tell the Egyptian people, who apparently had a problem with attractive women. He told her to basically tell people that you are my sister. Now, I don't know about you, but my wife would definitely not like that, right? And we're not told, is Sarah like that? But she went along with it, because even when Pharaoh's with the prince of Pharaoh comes and sees her, obviously they told Pharaoh and the people that, this is my sister, right? And so Pharaoh wants a relationship with her, wants to make her a wife, and so what does God do? He plagues Pharaoh and his household. And so Pharaoh says, why did you lie to me? Right? Why did you lie to me? And he tells Abram to take his wife Sarai and leave, to go. So even when Abraham struggled with his identity, struggled with his faith, struggled in the fact that God promised that he would make a great nation, so nobody's going to hurt you, nobody's going to curse you. If they try to curse you, I will curse them, right? Obviously, Abraham struggled with that, and God still redeemed Abraham and his wife Sarah by allowing Pharaoh to allow them to go. So just wanted to point that out towards the end of this. Well, so that's going to conclude our study in Genesis chapter 12. I hope this was helpful in some way. But again, I want you to continue to look at this and think about the challenges that Abraham is facing as we see the 100 years of Abraham's service to the Lord. So thank you so much for class. I appreciate you tuning in, and may God bless you, and we will definitely see you next time.
Thanks for joining us, and we hope and pray that our messages are encouraging and are uplifting and are helpful in your walk with God. To get more information and more content for your journey with God, we want to encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and also join us on Facebook and like our page there, and you'll get all of our messages, our Bible classes, and any other messages that might come down our pipe as we continue to create and try to share God's Word. God bless you, and we'll see you next time.